Welcome to Lesson 12 in the C# from Start to Finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to start working on the Create Team form. In our last couple of videos, we worked on getting the data access set up for our Create Prize form. In this video, we're going to do basically the same thing we did in the prize form, only this time it will be to add a new team member or a new person. And before we get to the code, I want to point something out. And this is something I touch on often, but I want to drive this point home. Don't get overwhelmed by complexity. Break it down into small chunks. Figure out which chunk you can do, and then do that chunk, and then come back and try again. Figure out a new chunk to do and do that. By the time you've eliminated all the chunks that you can do, the problem should be fairly small. Let's take a look at our form. As you can see, there's a lot going on in this form. And especially if you're a newer C# developer, I'm sure this can be a bit overwhelming. We have 4 buttons, 2 lists, and a bunch of tables behind the scenes that we need to use to support this form. But if we look at this in chunks, we can see there's an Add New Member section that's practically a separate form. And it looks and it operates just like the prize form. And that makes it a very clear chunk that we can do. And since it isn't really tied to anything else in this form until the very end, after we've created the new member, let's start there. Now the first thing to point out is that the Add New Member is actually adding a new person. We come to the database and look at the people table and do the design view. We have first name, last name, email address, and cell phone number. When we talk about a team member, all we're really talking about is the person ID and the team ID. So this is more an add person. But in the form, it makes sense to call it Add New Member since we're talking about team members. So with that in mind, let's create the event for this button. Now there's a couple different ways you can create events. If you want the default event, which we do, you can double click on the button and that will create the event in the code. Or you can go to Properties, go to this lightning bolt up here. We click on that and find the event we want and either do a drop down and select an already created event for us, or we double click in this area in the gray space, or the white space, whatever the color is that your background is. If you double click here, it will create that event as well. And you can do that in any one of your events. Now we're doing a default event, so I can just double click right here and it creates that event for us. Now this comes back to naming. We worked hard to make sure that everything was named properly. And we did that up front because when you start creating events, this created the Create Member button _click event. Well, that's tied to the Create Member button. But if I had called this button 1, then this would be button 1 _click. If I come back over here and change this to the Create Member button, this event will not change its name. We have to go in and manually change that name. And that's just a pain. So my suggestion is get your naming done first. The first thing you do right out of the gate, so you're sure that your naming's locked in before you start creating events. Now in this event, essentially what we want to do is we want to take the 4 fields here, create a person model out of them, and then save that to either the database or the text file. So just like, let's go over and look real quick at the prize form code. We validate the form, create a prize model, save that prize model, and then clear out the form. So that's essentially what we're going to do again in this one. So the first step is to validate this form. And what validation do we want to have on this form? Well, we can just create a method Do we call it is valid? Let's check it out real quick. It's usually good to keep, now we call it validate form. It's usually good to keep the same naming convention so you just know what to expect. When I see validate form, I know it's going to do a certain task. And really here, we could do something very, very simple, or even if we said, you know, at this point, we're not going to put validation in, we could say to do add validation to the form, and then just return true. Because now we can use this and it will work every time, and it's not going to validate anything yet, but later we can come back and say, okay, now I want to put validation in. I go to do right here, and I actually do validation and return true or false. And so that's a way to kind of bypass the work of validation now and come back and do it later, or come back later and say, I want to up the validation, make it more impressive, more, more robust. For example, for right now, we're just going to say these 4 fields have to have a value. For email address, we could actually validate it to make sure that it has the @ symbol, and that something's before that @ symbol, and there's something after that @ symbol, and there's a dot in there somewhere for, so it'd be tim@iamtimcorey.com. So we can validate certain things, or we can get really robust and say, okay, there's certain special characters it shouldn't have, and all the rest to validate just the email address, say a cell phone number. We could get really specific on, especially if we're expecting US, we could say, okay, a US phone number has 11 numbers maximum. That would be the country code, the area code, and a 7-digit phone number. Now it doesn't account for extensions, but we're saying it's a cell phone number, not a business line. And we can do all those validations, but for right now, I'm just going to validate first name, last name, email, and cell phone all have some type of string in there. So if first name value dot text dot length equals 0, return false. Okay, so I've got this first check here. I'll actually copy this. Now I'll paste it in and change this from first name value to last name value. And then once again for email address and cell phone number. Oops. Cell phone value .text.length. So .text.length, what it does, it says here's the number, the length says here's the number of characters in this property, which is the actual value, whatever's inside of this box. And so it's going to say, is it equal to 0? If it is, return false. So we're going to say if validate form. So if that's true, it's a valid form, therefore we do something. We can also have our else. P.lastname equals last name value.text, p.email address equals email value.text, and finally p.cellphone number equals cellphone value.text. Once we're done all of that, then we have to send this off to be created. We have the model. Now we actually save this to our database or text file. And if you ever get lost as to where you are, since we've already done this once, you can come back over here to the code for our create prize form, validate form, create the model. Now we go to globalconfig.connection.create prize. Only instead of create prize, we're going to say global connection, right? Nope, that's not right. Global config, there we go. I'm going to copy that and paste that so I make sure I type it right. Add the using statement for tracker library. Global config dot connection dot, and we have just create prize. We don't want to create a prize. We want to create a person. And pass in our model. So how do we do that? Well, we have to come up here and first look at our iData connection. We have the prize model create prize, passing the prize model. In the same way, person model create person, person model model. So that creates a new entry in our interface. Now that's going to break all of our current classes that implement iData connection, which is actually a good thing. Because that'll remind us, we need to implement the solution or the contract for this iData connector or connection. And so in this case, we have to add the create person method. We come over to text connection, and the same thing happens. It kicks in and says, oh, nope, you can't do that. We have to hit control dot. That little light bulb there kind of goes away. It's hard to track down. Half the time I get it, half the time I don't. And so I have to do control dot and hit enter for the top one. In this case, we have now the create person for the text file. So we'll come back to the text file. Let's start with the SQL file. And the SQL file is going to do exactly the same thing as this one does, only with different values. I can copy this. Now, I said before that copy and paste is dangerous, and it really is. So if you're not absolutely sure you can go step by step and replace these things, don't do this. Actually type it out. It's up to you. For this video, it's much more convenient for me to copy and paste than it is to go ahead and type all this back out. All right, so now I've got to fill in my parameters. Well, I don't have place number. The first thing I have is first name, and I have last name. I have email address and cell phone. So those are 4 fields I have. I will probably name these the same. Now again, right now I'm guessing because I haven't actually created this insert store procedure yet. It'll be sp people insert. Now the other thing I don't have is that model.id. If you notice in the prize model, I have this ID. I'm actually going to copy the whole thing. The person model, we haven't created that ID yet. Remember, we didn't actually put our IDs in yet in our models. We left that off accidentally. And so we have to create those IDs because we need to know what those are. All right, so we have an ID now. So now we can actually pull the ID back out and return the model. And really everything here is wired up the way it should be. We're connecting to the tournaments connection string. We're creating our dynamic parameter list, which just happens to be the same, or the 5 parameters. They're different parameters, but it's still 5. The first 4 are first name, last name, email address, and cell phone number. And the last one is our ID, which gets passed the other direction. And so we pull that ID back out. It's called ID. We put that into our model and return the model. So let's take this and go over to our store procedures here and say new store procedure. We can get rid of all this top stuff. Create procedure. What's the procedure name? Well, it's actually dbo.sp people_insert. What are the parameters? At first name. And that's going to be of type. Let's look at the columns here. That's of type nvarchar100. At last name, nvarchar100. At email address, nvarchar100. And at cell phone number, varchar20. So be careful on that we get the types right, nvarchar versus varchar, and the number correct, so we can limit to the same limit as the table does. And if you get lost here, I do have a course on SQL that is very helpful for C# developers because it kind of gives you a good introduction all the way through actually building real databases that actually work and are a little more complex than just a starter tutorial, but more real world in how they're built. And so that really gives you a good foundation to work with SQL databases. All right, so at ID int output. Let's say equals 0. Output. I said equals 0 because we may not even pass in this variable. Now you will, but if someone wanted to call this without passing it in because they don't have it yet, that's fine. We'll default it to 0. Now we can take this out and we can say insert into dbo. So if we execute this, we're good to go there. We can actually refresh our list. Make sure it shows up in the list. And it does. Right there. So now we should have an implemented SQL database save for our person. And now if we come back to our, not the prize form, the create team form, we can say p equals, and pass it back in. But since we're not actually going to use that anywhere, let's not create a new variable unnecessarily or overwrite that variable unnecessarily. And the reason we're not using that yet is because this is only part one of this form. We're just creating the new member. And really we're dropping it off at that point. We're done. We're not putting it in this list yet. We're not putting it in this list yet. We're just done. And that's because this right here, this add new member section, is one chunk. We're going to do that chunk and then move on. Not try to do 3 or 4 or 5 at once, because that's where the issues slip in, where you start forgetting about sections like, oops, I didn't implement the text connector. So back over here, the last thing this form needs to do is actually clear out first name value dot text equals empty string, last name value dot text equals empty string, email value dot text equals empty string, and cell phone value dot text equals empty string. All right, so that clears that form out. And now we have created a new member when you say create new member. Now, we've just done a SQL connection, but let's test it to make sure it works. And I'm big on testing before you move on. So if you can get a little bit done and test it, that's great. Do that. So in order to do that, we have to come back here to Program and change our database type back to SQL. We had changed that before to test our text connector for the prize form. Now we're coming back to test our SQL connector for the create team form. All right, and we're going to test right here. The other thing we need to change back over here is we are running the create prize form, but we're not testing that anymore. Instead, we want to test the create team form. So let's change that in our startup. And now we can run this. Let me get it started here. Okay, I also want to open up SQL here, and I'll close this out, the procedure. And instead, I'm going to open up a new query window and just say select star from dbo.people. And we have nothing in the list. That'll be important to know for when we actually create somebody. All right, we're going to say Tim Corey, Tim at imtimcorey.com. The cell phone number is 111-555-1212, as in, no, I'm not giving that out. Create member. It blanks this out, which means something happened. If we run this query, we now have Tim Corey, Tim at imtimcorey.com, and 111-555-1212. Don't forget that right now we're not validating this, so it just goes in however we put it in. But SQL works. So that was really quick. That didn't take much time at all to implement this form. And part of the reason why is because we've done this before, and so we know what to expect and know the pattern to use, and so it kind of gets a lot easier. It's a lot easier than it was the last time when we had to figure out how to create the interfaces and how to set things up and so on and so forth, where this one we just say, use the same system we already set up. As you grow and develop as a C# developer, you'll have some of these things in your library, your personal library, where whether it's a formal library you have set up or just the patterns that you remember doing, you'll have these things to refer back to. It makes your job easier and easier, which is why it seems like senior level developers just fly through code. It's not really that they're flying through the code as much as it is they're just re-implementing the ideas they've already had. And maybe it's new in different ways, and maybe it's, a little twist on things here and there, but they're just solving the little areas that are complex, and the big areas that are just kind of generic, they're reusing patterns from their previous development career. So that's just something to keep in mind, that as you get more and more experience, this becomes easier and easier. And that's just my encouragement to you, to always be practicing. The more you practice, the more you push yourself, the easier and easier these patterns become, where you can just re-implement it quickly. Okay, enough of the soapbox. Let's move on to implementing the text connector. So before I leave this, I'm going to switch this back to text just so we have it ready for ourselves. So I can close this out. And now I'm going to open up my text connector and essentially do the same thing as this, only up here for the create person. And the very first thing I need is immediately prize models store prize models. So therefore, person model goes into person models. Now, the casing here, the singular versus plural, you can figure that out for yourself. Naming's hard. Figure out what you want to do. My encouragement to you is always keep the same pattern going. In this case, I'm going to call it plural here, and then I'm going to call it the name of the model, and then pluralize that for the file name. Okay, so that's really minor, but that's up to you how you want to do it. So the first thing I want to do is say, just following the same pattern here, I want a list of person model called people equals, I'll even call it people file dot full file path, and that works the same way, dot load file dot convert to person models. Now we don't have a convert to person models yet. So we need to create that. Where do we create that? I'm going to copy that. We create that in the text connector processor. And that's right here. Convert to prize models. Well, down below it, we're going to have the public static list of person model. Convert to person models. This list of string lines. And this really is essentially the same thing as above. So it's going to be a list of person model. We're going to call this output equals new list of person model for each string line in lines. Now at some point you're probably thinking, wait a minute, you preach dry, the don't repeat yourself acronym. And how is this not repeating yourself? Because I'm essentially copying from up here down to here. And yes, it really is pretty close. The difference is it's not the same. We're using different models, and we'll use the different mappings down here. So it is different. With that being said, there is a way you could create one method that does any different type. It would be kind of complex, and I would encourage you, if you want to go down that road, instead of rewriting all that code, and it's really could be kind of complex, instead think about looking into a library called AutoMapper. AutoMapper will do a lot of this mapping for you from one type to another, or from even this, this list of string here. It can map that out into something different, like a list of prize model. So there's ways you can map it, and I'd encourage you to look at AutoMapper if you want to go that direction. But I will tell you this would get a little complex. And the reason it gets complex is because we're not mapping a string to a string most of the time. Most of the time, we have other values as well, like decimal and double and int. These all need parsed. These need to be parsed properly. And you need to handle the idea of error handling, which we haven't done yet. But the idea of what do you do when those things blow up? And all that work needs to be somewhere. And it's different for every column. Therefore, it's kind of complex. Therefore, the easiest way to do this is to spell out your mapping in a method, and then have a method for every single different type of model. Yes, it's a lot of code, but sometimes you have to write a lot of code. All right. So I'm going to start writing code. String array calls equals line dot split single quotes with a comma inside. And that splits our line, which is one record. It splits it up by commas. Therefore, we can have it comma delimited. The key here, though, to note is we're splitting on commas if you have commas in your data. That could be a problem, because with commas in your data, then you're adding extra columns essentially and putting the wrong data in the wrong columns. And that's a problem. Now, you can wrap your strings inside of quotes, and that won't happen then if you're careful, but this split will still split on that, since the split is really just a really basic splitter. It's not the more complex CSV processors that are out there. The quotes will help with opening Excel and those type of things. The quotes won't help you here unless you do a little more processing in this code. So just note that the cheap way, the easy way to fix that, if you do want to have commas, is to use a different character to split on. Instead of comma, it could be any character. So you could even have, something weird like the pipe command, the pipe key. That. You could use that. You could use the hashtag. You could use the @ symbol, which wouldn't work really well because you probably have email addresses and that uses the @ symbol. So you have to think things through, but you could also split. There's an overload of split. If you do the Control-Shift-Space in here, we are using the char separator, but we could also do down here the string separator, which is the double quotes. With a string separator, we could actually separate on more than one character. So that looked like this, the double quotes. Inside here, we could say, double pipe or triple pipe, or we could have, something even weirder like maybe it's pipe and then the caret and then pipe. And if you have that in your text, you're going to have problems anyways. So you could do something complex like that if you wanted to split in order to get around the idea of having commas in your data, or possibly have commas in your data. But in our case, I'm going to assume, at least for now, that we have no commas in our data. If we find there are commas, I'll either change this right here to something else, or I'll take those commas out in the validation process. Okay, so now we need to create our person model. We'll call it P. We're going to start adding to it. So p dot first name equals calls 0. Remember, ordering is now important. Calls 1. P dot email address. I'm using the same order I've used over and over again. Notice since they're strings, it's really easy. There's no parsing to do. All right, so there's the 4 lines. And then I can just say output dot add p. And I forgot one. And it's going to change the order, which is a problem. Did you catch the one I missed? p.id equals calls 0. And that's going to yell at me because I need to have int.parse calls 0. And again, that parse will blow up and crash our application since it's an unhandled exception if we pass in a non-number string. Okay, so we've created our person model. We have added the 5 values to the 5 properties. And then we've taken that and added it to our output list. And so the last thing is return output. So we can save that. We can come back to our text connector and pick up where we left off, which was we were just creating this final piece here so that now we have our people, which is a list of person model. That people has now been created. And what this line has done is it has taken our file name, personmodels.csv, converted that to full path using our app.config. It's loaded that file, making sure it exists. And if it doesn't exist, it returns back an empty list. But it takes that list, if there is a list of the empty list, and it converts it to a list of person model. Again, if it's an empty list, we get an empty list of person model. Otherwise, we get a list of all the people in our CSV file. Next, we're going to need to find the max ID. In current ID, we're going to start off, initialize it at 1. Remember down here we said that we start off, the current ID is going to be the max ID plus 1. So if we can't find any records, then we're going to leave it at the default, which is 1, which is what we want to start the first ID at. So if people.count is greater than 0, the current ID equals people.order by descending x arrow x.id. So that's going to order this people list descending by ID. Take the first one, take its ID, add 1 to it, and that's the value of the current ID. Then we're going to take our model, the one passed in to create person, model.id equals current ID. Then we'll take that, say people.add our model. So whatever we have on our list, whether it's an empty list or a list of 5 or 10 or whatever, people, we're going to add our new person that we want to create into that list. Just what we did down here. And then we're going to say people.save to people file. And take the people file and pass that in. We don't have that method yet. What is the people file? Well, just like the save to prize file, we're going to create a save to people file. And that again is over here in the text connector. It's the text connector helper or the processor. Save to prize file. Well, we're going to public static void I'm in the wrong spot. That's why. All right, there we go. Save to people file. It's not there. If I hit Control J and look for my even save to prize file, the method we created before that we're already using and down below what we're using, I don't find it. Why is that? Well, because the extension method for save to prize file is on a list of prize model. Over here, we have a list of person model, not prize model. Therefore, it's not even going to find this extension method. So that's going to loop through our list of person model, our models. For each one, it's going to add that entry to our lines string. And then finally, we have the file.write all lines, file name dot full file path. Oops. File name dot full file path. And lines, just like up here. Could have copied and pasted. What this does is it writes all the lines we're going to pass in. That's these. Where is it right at 2? This file name, but the file name is not good enough. We need the full file path, including that name, which is what this extension method does for us. With that being said, we can save that, come back over here. This is now working properly, at least it should be. The last step we need to do is return model. Why? Well, we have created our list of the existing people. We found the max ID and add 1 to it, or given a 1 if we don't have any people. And we've taken that and put it in as our model's ID number. Now it has an ID number. We have saved this model along with all the rest of our models, if any, back to our text file. And now we're passing back the original model you got passed in only this time it has an ID associated with it. Okay, that's it. So now let's start this up. I can pull this over. I'll also pull over our folder. Notice our folder has the prizemodels.csv file, but not our person models. So let's add Joe Smith, Joey at smithy.com. Let's just do a 555-1234. Not a great phone number. It doesn't have the area code or country code. That's okay. Create member. And now we have a person model.csv. I can open that with Notepad. Pull that over and it says 1 Joe Smith, Joey at smithy.com, and our phone number. Just to make sure that still works, if we do another one, let's do Sue Storm, Sue at stormy.net, and a cell phone number is that. We'll create the member, and we'll look at this file again. And now we have ID number of 2, which means we are incrementing our ID, and all the values are still there. So that's great. We are now saving to our text file as well as to our SQL file. And with that, we have implemented this little section here. Really pretty simple, because it's the same code, or at least mostly the same code, the same pattern as our create prize form was. So this chunk is done. The next chunk we're going to look at is filling in these lists here. Our team members list box, our select team member list or drop down box. We'll see if we can wire these two up and then look at actually creating our team from whoever is here. All right, so stick around for that.